In the last video, we had a look at importing an audio loop, and we took a look at using some of the analysis controls in order to help us get the best split we can from our stereo audio loop. Now, as you recall, where we left off was that we have these different elements, and for the most part, Regroover Pro has done a really good job in terms of isolating these. And it's done so by grouping like frequency content together. And also you might find that you have some of the attacks on certain layers and some of the sustains on other layers, and they can also be grouped by the frequency content. So for example, if we listen to layer 3, you can hear that we have some lower end information, and it's got a lot of attack in it, but it also has a little bit of sustain, but it's in the lower areas. Now, if we listen to layer 2 over here, you can see that it's done something similar. Now, the initial thought might be that you would expect that this would just do an amazing job right off the bat, and it would separate your kick and your snare and your hi-hat, and you wouldn't have anything to concern yourself with. But one thing that you have to think about in terms of the way that this algorithm works is that it's doing its best to get you at a really good starting point for you to be able to isolate these different layers, and also for you to do some further editing on them. And that's where the power of the annotation tool comes in. Now, before we get too far into this, I want to look at one different option over here, which is this lock. Now, we have the ability to lock these different layers, and this really comes into play when we're using the annotation tool, because essentially what this means is that if we're trying to affect or do some editing between these layers, and we want to essentially hand off these different sections of audio, and for example, merge the sustain of the snare in layer 2 with the attack of the snare in layer 1, and also with the attack of the snare in layer 3 a little bit further on down the line, we need to be able to eliminate some of these layers from that process, because every time we do any editing, we have to resplit the tracks over here, and this essentially means that it will redistribute the audio. Now keep in mind, we have this rule, which is the golden rule of Regroover Pro, is that the summed signal of all of the layers always have to equal out to be the same as a stereo file that we dragged in. Okay, so I know that's a little bit confusing, but I promise it's all going to make sense in a second. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to really quickly over here is this grid mode. So in previous versions of Regroover Pro, we didn't have this grid mode, which meant that everything we did, it was free time, or in a slit mode where we didn't have any reference to a grid. Now, as of a more recent version, we now have this grid mode, which is really useful. So for example, I'm going to stick this into quarter notes for now, but there's a good chance that I may end up going off the grid if I need to, or if I feel like I need to get a little bit more information. But for example, we can take a look at this file over here. Now, if I grab this annotation tool and double click, I've just selected this particular section of the layer on layer 1. So for example, if I was to solo this out and play this, so the section that I'm playing over here is just the snare hit. And this is the upper mid-range content and the attack transient of the snare hit. Now, don't be fooled by this initial point over here, because this is actually the transient of the kick drum. So one thing, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. We're going to cover this in a future video, but one thing I can do if you really want to adjust your audio to help yourself isolate things a little bit better is I can change the looping range of this particular layer. So if I play this and I engage transport from within the plugin GUI, now another thing that I could do here is I could go to a little bit more of a fine resolution. So for example, 16th notes. And I could grab this over here. Now let's go ahead and listen to this. I'm just going to go ahead and play this. Now, another thing that we can do is, of course, we can go with grid mode off. And I can go ahead and I can just move this back a little bit. Now, in addition to being able to use these markers to addition this section over here, I can also adjust the drag handles of the actual sections that I want to adjust. So for example, if I wanted to go ahead and go without a grid, I could go ahead and I could now do the same thing over here, and I could double click this section over here, and I'm going to move this right to the end. Now in theory, what I should have, just going to drag my MIDI markers all the way so I'm playing the full loop, is I should have the snare attack from both of these hits over here. Now the idea is actually quite simple. When we have the annotation tool engaged, I can merge anything that I have highlighted from this section. I can merge it onto other audio tracks. And the way that I can navigate where this information is going to get merged with is by locking off other layers. So for example, layer 4, I know that it has nothing to do with my snare hits. So what I want to do is I want to lock this layer off. Now let's have a listen to layer 3. You know what? We're going to deal with layer 3 later. So let's go ahead and let's lock this off. And right now what I want to do is I want to merge this information with layer 2. Now because I've locked off layer 3 and layer 4, and because I'm highlighting content from layer 1, this only leaves this content with one place to go. So if I'm locking off layer 3 and 4, and I hit this split option when I have my annotation tool selected, and we've created this highlighted range of content, this will now reanalyze this loop, and it will send this information over here, and it will merge it with layer 2. Watch and have a look. Okay, so now we have layer 2. Let's have a listen to our layer 2 now. So let's go ahead and we'll play this. Okay, perfect. Now, one thing that I might also concern myself with, or I might as well do at this point, is because I'm building what I hope to be an isolated snare track, I might as well go ahead and do the same thing I did with layer 1, and I might as well isolate these transients over here, and I might as well send these over to layer 2 as well. Now, in order to do that, I simply have to lock off my layer 1, and then I'm going to just double click in this section over here. Keep in mind, when I double click, we have our annotation tool selected, it will create a highlighted range as well, but I have to unlock it first. So let's go ahead, we'll double click here. It creates a predetermined highlighted area. Now, of course, we can adjust these drag handles like this, or if you want to be really precise and your loops were done on a grid, we could also activate our grid mode. So for example, we could go with, you know what, let's go with a 30-second note. That looks like it'll be pretty good. And we could just snap this. I always like to do a little bit before and after. And again, we'll go here. And this now is just snapping to this grid moves over here. Now, the idea here is that I want to keep layer 4 locked. Layer 1, I want to be locked. Layer 2 and layer 3 are unlocked. And now I want to force this highlighted information from layer 3 into layer 2. And this will be the low-end transient information and sustain from our snare track that we are now going to force to be merged with layer 2. Let's go ahead, make sure we have layer 4, layer 1 locked off, and we'll go ahead and we'll do that split. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's have a listen. Okay, so we're starting to get somewhere now. Now, I'm going to go ahead and unsolo this. Let's unlock this, and let's unlock this, and let's start having a listen to some of these layers now. Now, because we have this information that's been highlighted over here, and we're creating this isolated snare track, now would be a good time to create a kick track. So something else that I could consider doing would be to take the information from both layer 3 and force that to layer 1, and also we have some information over here as well. I want to determine to see whether this is hi-hat or kick information. Let's go ahead and play this. Okay. Let's merge it with the kick and see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all my solos off. Now, we have to keep in mind and we have to try to remember what we're doing here. It can be a little bit confusing at times, but layer 4, we know we want that to be hi-hats. Let's go ahead and lock that off. Now what I want to do is I can actually move this section over here. So let's go ahead and let's move this and let's move this. I want to give myself a little bit of, let's just call it pre-roll. And I want to merge this with our layer 1. Now, our layer 1, we've already taken this information and we've moved it to layer 2. So if we hold down Shift, you'll notice that we have this eraser. I can erase these ranges. So now we're going to be forcing the information from layer 3 into whatever active tracks we have. So let's lock layer 2, which is our snare. And in fact, let's start naming these layers. So for example, I can double click and let's name this snare. We'll push enter. Layer 1, let's name this kick. We'll push enter. And let's go to layer 4 and let's call this hats. And we'll push enter. Now there's a good chance that we're going to be left with 3 tracks, which means that one of these layers will be arbitrary, but let's not worry about that right now. So the next thing I want to do is I want to force this information to merge with layer 1, which is our kick. We have layer 4 and layer 2 locked, and we have layer 3 highlighted, which only leaves one extra layer for this information to go to. Let's go ahead and use the split option. Okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere. Let's have a listen to this layer. Okay, so starting to sound pretty good. I'm hearing a little bit of information here. So one thing that we can do, if that information isn't really necessary, then while we have this layer selected, I have this gate. So in order to get rid of this little bump, let's go ahead and press play and just dial this up. And of course, we can adjust our release. Okay, so now we've gotten rid of this little bump over here. Now, if I was really being OCD and I was trying to do my best job possible, I would most likely take this information and I would send it somewhere. But this is the whole concept that we have that we're working with. Now, the next thing I want to do is have a listen to this track again, this snare track, and let's see what these beginning elements are. I'm pretty sure they belong with the kick. They might also go with the hi-hat. Now we're going to use our command or control clicking so that we can listen to these together. Let's see if they work with the hi-hats. Okay, I think they actually belong with the kick drum. So the next thing I'm going to do is solo this out, my layer 3. Now I'm going to hold down my shift key and we're just going to erase these ranges. And now the last thing that I want to do over here is I want to take my layers and I want to send everything we have happening on our snare track. And I want to send this beginning information. So for this, I could actually go to quarter notes. Let's take everything and I have to unlock this. I'm going to double click and then I can also take this. And if I turn my grid off, I can pull this back a little bit. And now I'm going to be sending this information. And let's also do this one. A lot of the times I like to work without a grid for this because there's always a little bit of information before and after. And I want to send this to layer 1 to merge it with my kick. Let's unsolo this. Let's lock off layer 3 and 4. We'll deal with this in a moment. And we're going to send this information into layer 1. We've got layer 3 and 4 locked. That means that this highlighted information only has one place that it can end up. We'll go ahead and use the split option. And now let's have a listen to our layer 1. Okay, so we have a little error over here in terms of it sending some information over. That's okay. Let's go ahead and unsolo this and make sure that we are doing the right thing over here. I want to listen to my layer 3 quickly. Okay, this hit over here. Let me just lock off my kick track and let's just highlight this section over here. We have to unlock it before we can highlight an annotation range. And I want to send this into here and this section over here. Let's just erase these. I want to lock off this one and I want to lock off this one and we're going to send this to here now. Okay, so this has been sent over. Let's go ahead and have a listen. And last but not least, I forgot to lock off one of these layers over here. So let's just quickly unlock this for a moment and we'll create some new annotation ranges. I want to send this information over here and this information over here. I want to send these to the snare track. I'm going to lock off this. I'm going to lock this. Now this can only go here. We will split that. And now we should have a pretty good split. Now, layer 3 for the most part is pretty much going to be useless. But what I might do is just have a listen for some hi-hat artifacts. But in the meantime, let's go ahead now. Let's have a quick listen to our kick. Okay, sounds pretty good. We'll have a quick listen to our snare. And one thing that we can do, we know from previous videos, if we have this layer selected, we can dial up a gate. Okay, that sounds pretty good to me. Let's listen to this track over here. So, I mean, if we really wanted to, we could take all this information over here, and I could send this entire section. I could send this to the kick track because I'm hearing some low-end information. Let's go ahead and lock this one. We'll unlock this one. This is going to send everything here to here. Last thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to clear these ranges over here. So all of our layer 3 will now be sent over here if we do this split, and we have to make sure we have everything else locked off. Okay, so now that split has happened, so our kick track, this one now should be relatively clear. Right, we don't have anything left on this one now. One thing that I might consider doing at this point, I can go ahead and clear the section. I can just power this layer down entirely because we're not using it anymore. So now we have our kick, our snare, and our hats. Let's go ahead and have a listen. Right, our snare. And our hi-hats. And together, they play and they will equal or sum the same as the stereo loop that we dragged in. Okay, I'm going to come out of the annotation tool now. So now we've taken what was brought into Regroover Pro, and it takes a little bit of getting used to, I'm not going to lie, but once you kind of grasp the concept of how you can use the layers and the activity sliders to really fine-tune how the layers have been separated, the idea is that you want to get things into like groups of frequencies and content. Sometimes it'll do a really nice split where you have even attacks and then it handles the sustain. So it leaves these little gaps in between these areas, and it allows you to very quickly and easily highlight the different sections and force them onto the appropriate track. And then, of course, like we did over here, you can rename your tracks, and with a little bit of shuffling and making sure you pay careful attention to which tracks you're locking off, you can really get some fantastic results. And I've been able to do some stuff that's really like voodoo in terms of splitting loops up into discrete layers. Even if the initial analysis in terms of what was represented to me on the layers was kind of messy, with a little bit of work, and I'm talking maybe 2 minutes tops, I've been able to get really isolated, discrete layers from stereo loops. And then, of course, having the added things like the gate, EQ, compressor, saturation, which we're going to look at in a later video, it helps even further in terms of really finessing your end result. So now that we have our layers set up, we've used the analysis section and we've used the annotation tool to really fine-tune the selection and the discrete layers. Let's have a look at some of the ways that we can totally change the vibe or feel of this loop. So I'll catch up with you in the next video.